Welcome back to PM Agenda. If you live in or near Adelaide, Melbourne, or indeed here in Canberra, you won't need me to tell you it was a very hot summer. Just how hot? Well, according to the now independently funded Climate Council, a number of records were broken, more than 150, it says, and it's blaming this, not surprisingly, on climate change. I spoke a little earlier to Professor Steffen from the Climate Council.
Well, for me, the alarming ones are the ones that have hit the capital cities, which differentiates this year from last year when much of the heat was inland. If we look at Adelaide, for example, Adelaide had 11 days over 42 degrees Celsius. That's really hot.
And that hasn't happened for how long?
That's the first time it's happened.
First time
that's a record. Adelaide had its hottest February day ever, nearly 45 degrees Celsius, 44.7. If we move here to Canberra, Canberra had 17 days of 36 degrees or higher. The long-term average is 5. So we went from 17 compared to 5. So this is really a lot of hot weather. We had here in Canberra 4 days in a row over 39, temperature top 39. Again, that was a record. When we look at Melbourne, Melbourne set one of the more interesting ones. If you take the temperature over a 24-hour period, day and night, and average it, they hit 35.5. So that's really very, very hot. No relief during the night, and that's the sort of thing that affects people. The last one, if you jump from cities to large areas, if you look at Queensland as a whole, it had its hottest day ever, 34.5 degrees averaged over the entire state.
Was this nationally, though, one of the hottest summers?
Yeah, it was one of the hottest summers, and the way we look at that is to look at when of the hottest summers occurred. We've got records going back to 1910. This was one of the 8 hottest ones. There are a whole bunch of them bunched up there, and those 8 have all occurred in the last 15 years. They've bunched up in the recent past, since the late 1990s. So it's absolutely clear when you look at
so 8 of the hottest summers,
the 8 hottest
since 1910, have happened in the last 15 years.
The 8 hottest have happened in the last 15 years. Since the 8 hottest, since we've kept records since 1910, have occurred in the last 15 years. So it's clear that this trend toward extreme hot weather is really ramping up. There are other ways you can look at it too. You can look at the ratio of record hot days set to record cold days set. And if you look at a climate that isn't shifting fundamentally, you see that it's about the same number. On average, if you average it over many decades, you get about the same number of hot as cold. But since the 1960s, last 5-6 decades, we see that we've had more than twice as many hot records as we've had cold records. In the last decade, the ratio is 3 to 1.
Can I ask, why isn't it getting hotter everywhere? Yes, it sounds like a lot of places we've had a pretty hot summer, certainly here in Canberra.
Yeah.
But why not everywhere if indeed the globe is warming?
It's because there's lots of natural geographical variability in how the system works. Now the system is changing, atmospheric circulation is changing, and one effect of that we see in the northern hemisphere is that it's dragging down very cold Arctic air to locations that were further south than they were before. So a better way of putting it is that the climate's being destabilized, the climate system. So patterns that we've come to know, patterns around which we've developed our economies and our cities and where we live, are now shifting. We see that most clearly in temperature, but rainfall patterns are also shifting. And we see in general that if you look at the areas in Australia that are wet during the summer, and that's in the north and the northwest, they're getting wetter. They're getting quite a bit wetter. When you're looking at the areas of Australia where the rainfall mainly comes in the cool months, southwest WA and the south, they're actually seeing a drying trend. So we're seeing shifts in patterns of rainfall as well.
And obviously a lot of people also point out, why then has it been such record cold weather in the United States? Over there, winter, our summer. How does that fit?
Yeah, well, as I was mentioning before, these atmospheric circulation patterns are changing. Now there's more research to be done on that, but we think we're getting a handle on that. And it's because the differential between the equator and the North Pole, which used to be very steep, is now weakening. And that's weakening because...
In terms of atmospheric pressure?
Temperature.
Temperature.
Temperature. And that's because the Arctic is warming at twice the rate as the global average. So it's warming roughly everywhere, but at a faster rate in the northern high latitudes. So the difference is actually decreasing. What that means is the jet stream, it follows a track, a west to east track around the northern hemisphere. That track, the guardrails, if you like, are weakening, softening. And so the jet stream is wandering more north and south than it used to. Now, the opposite effect, it's dragging extremely warm weather up north. If you look at Siberia, they had an exceptionally hot November, for example, and are way above average. So when you average all the freakish weather, on average it's warming. But you're getting enormous changes now in certain locations because the atmospheric circulation patterns are now shifting. And this is what we mean by the climate system is destabilizing.
And that explains the record cold,
absolutely,
or the very cold
yes,
weather that we've seen
in the US.
In
fact, one of the most striking things, in my view, about the US, and I remember as a lad growing up there, I grew up in roughly what's called the upper Midwest, and that was always cold. I mean, what they saw this winter was what was a normal winter for me as a lad. What was unusual is if you look in the southeast of America, they've had some really unusually cold weather. So that's an example of that jet stream wandering much further south than it normally does.
Back here in Australia, though, the Prime Minister in his recent drought tour said that, quote, if you look at the records of Australian agriculture going back 150 years, there has always been good times, bad times. This is not a new thing in Australia. As the seasons have changed, climatic variation has been a constant here in Australia. Is he right that this climatic variation has been a constant?
Climate variability has always been with us, and Australia is one of the most variable continents on the planet, that's for sure. But what science is doing now is teasing out how that variability is changing. Now, we've always had extreme hot weather, and in some parts, like in the snowy mountains around Canberra, we've had some pretty cold weather. That's part of our natural variability. But as I said before, we are seeing systematic shifts in that variability. And we know why that's happening. We're putting more heat in the atmosphere because of greenhouse gases. They're stacking the odds toward more hot weather and less cold, and that's precisely what we see. Now, the tricky thing, and that's probably what the Prime Minister was referring to there, was what about rainfall? What about drought? And we've always had extremes. We've had some pretty severe droughts. We had the Federation drought over 100 years ago. We had the World War II drought. We had the Millennium drought. They've been around. What you need to do is see, are we seeing any changes in patterns, long-term patterns of that variability? And the answer is yes, we think we are. We're seeing cool weather drying in the southwest of WA and in the southern part of the southeastern part of the continent. In other words, in Victoria, southern South Australia, and so on. And we're getting a pretty good handle on why that's occurring. That's occurring because in wintertime, cool months, most of that rain comes off the Southern Ocean. It's those rain-bearing fronts that you see on the beautiful bomb maps, that frontal system coming up off the Bight and sweeping over the southeast corner of the continent. Those systems are slipping southward by a couple degrees latitude. And the reason for that is the so-called Hadley cells, the pattern of upward airflow at the equator because it's hot, and then the subsidence down in the subtropics, those are extending toward the poles, and so they're pushing that frontal system further south. So we have pretty good evidence that the reason the southeast and the far southwest are getting drier is linked to climate change. So I think you have to go beyond just saying, well, it's always been variable. How is the variability changing and why it's changing? And is climate change having an influence? And that's where science is saying, certainly on temperatures, we're extremely confident we're seeing a pretty clear influence of climate change. And on certain aspects of the rainfall patterns, yes, we're seeing that too. So this means that some of our most populous and most productive regions of Australia look to be more drought prone in the future because of climate change.
Professor Will Steffen, thank you.
My pleasure.
Professor Will Steffen of the Climate Council. Clearly it's not going to convince some on the argument around climate change, but they are the figures, the facts and figures that the Climate Council is putting out there on the back of what they say has been an angry summer across Australia. We'll take a break on PM Agenda for viewers in